The old man moved slowly along the cracked sidewalk, his weathered hand gripping the handle of a battered cane. His military jacket, faded to a dull green, bore the faint outline of medals long since removed. Every morning, just after sunrise, he made the same walk to the edge of town, where the old brick orphanage stood behind sagging iron gate. To most, he was a forgotten relic of a past war, a man who had outlived his usefulness, clinging to routines that no one cared about. The neighborhood kids called him the limping ghost, and some adults whispered that he only visited the orphanage to beg for sympathy or handouts. But he never responded to the whispers. His eyes, pale blue and sharp despite his years, were always fixed on the orphanage. He would bring a bag of groceries, sometimes toys carved by his own hands, other times simple books he found at garage sales. He would sit on the creaking wooden bench under the oak tree in the yard, waiting patiently until the children came running out. They would surround him like a swarm of bright voices and small hands, eager for stories of distant lands, of courage, of kindness. Still, not everyone saw the beauty in his quiet devotion. The staff, overworked and suspicious, often muttered among themselves. To them, he was nothing but a poor old veteran with no family of his own, wasting time telling fairy tales to kids who needed real guidance. A few local parents, uneasy about a man with no ties to the orphanage spending so much time there, had even complained to the director. The director, under pressure, once told him to limit his visits, to stop bothering the children. He simply nodded, came back the next day, and sat under the oak again, waiting with the same quiet dignity. The man's name was Thomas Gray, but no one bothered to ask. He had served 30 years ago in places most people preferred not to think about. The years had taken his youth, his friends, even his right leg below the knee. The prosthetic limb clicked softly under his trousers as he walked, a mechanical reminder of sacrifices that had never been recognized. He had never married, never built a family of his own. Perhaps that was why he felt drawn to these children, lonely souls looking for warmth, just as he was. Every visit, he carried himself with a kind of gentle authority, the kind that doesn't need to be announced. When he knelt to tie a child's shoelace, the kids looked at him as if he were a giant. When he read to them, his voice softened in a way that surprised even him. These moments were his only true victories now, small and unspoken. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. He had arrived as usual, drenched from head to toe, his jacket darkened by the downpour. The children rushed to greet him, but a group of parents stood nearby, their arms crossed, their faces cold. They spoke in low, disapproving tones, glancing at him as though he were an intruder. One woman shook her head and said, "Why does he keep coming here? Doesn't he have anywhere else to go?" Another muttered something about old men with too much time. The children heard it. They saw the way their beloved Thomas lowered his gaze, how his hand tightened slightly on the cane. They didn't understand why adults could be so unkind, but they felt the sting of it all the same. That evening, while he sat quietly under the oak tree, one of the older boys, Peter, slipped into the orphanage attic. He returned with something wrapped carefully in cloth, a faded album of photographs and letters that had been gathering dust for years. The next day, when Thomas arrived, the children were waiting, not just to play but to show him something. They led him to the bench and placed the album in his lap. As he opened it, the pages revealed his own younger face, captured in uniform, standing proudly with his unit. There were clippings of newspaper articles, mentions of the soldier who had single-handedly saved a village overseas during a conflict most people had forgotten. And there was a letter, signed by the original founder of the orphanage, thanking Thomas Gray for the donation that had rebuilt the very building they now called home. It turned out that, decades ago, when he first returned from the war, Thomas had quietly given most of his savings and pension to keep the orphanage from closing. The children surrounded him, their small hands resting on his shoulders. For once, the yard was silent except for the sound of pages turning. The staff, who had always treated him as a curiosity, now stood at the windows, stunned by the truth unfolding before them. The photo album rested gently on Thomas Gray's lap, his calloused fingers trembling as he turned the yellowed pages. He had not seen some of those images in decades. Pictures of dusty streets lined with sandbags, of younger men smiling with hollow eyes, of himself standing beside a small, burning schoolhouse that he had once helped evacuate before it collapsed. He never expected anyone to remember. Certainly not a group of children who hadn't even been born when he made those sacrifices. And yet, here they were, gathered around him as though he were a living monument to something they instinctively respected, even if they didn't understand it fully. They didn't care about medals or uniforms or battlefields. They cared that he came every day, that he listened, that he remembered their birthdays when no one else did, that he saw them. Peter stepped forward. He held up the letter, the one from the founder, written decades ago in looping cursive. His voice was steady but quiet as he read it aloud. The words spilled into the courtyard, like sunlight breaking through overcast skies. To Mr. Thomas Gray, whose silent generosity saved this home and these children. A gasp rippled from the orphanage director, standing at the doorway. A staff member covered her mouth. A few of the skeptical parents looked down at their feet, their cheeks flushed with a shame they could not admit. The old man they had mocked, the limping ghost, the wandering vet, was the reason the orphanage had survived in the first place. One of the younger girls, barely 6, climbed onto the bench beside him and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, in a voice so small it seemed to carry more weight than any speech. Thomas didn't speak for a long time. He simply stared at the children, their bright eyes full of something he hadn't felt in years. Recognition, not for what he had done, but for who he was. In the days that followed, the story spread. One of the staff members posted a picture of Thomas with the children on social media, along with a short caption, "The man who gave us everything without asking for anything." The post went viral. Local news outlets picked it up. Veterans groups reached out. A reporter came by to ask for an interview, but Thomas politely declined. He didn't want attention. He wanted the children to be safe, to feel seen, to be told they mattered. But the town changed. Parents who had once eyed him with suspicion now nodded respectfully when he passed. The orphanage received new donations from people moved by the story, and the director quietly apologized to Thomas one afternoon beneath the oak tree, placing a new bench in his honor, carved with the words, "For the man who never left." One morning, a young couple arrived at the orphanage gates. The woman, in her 30s, wore a crisp blazer and carried a bouquet of wildflowers. The man beside her held the hand of a little boy. They walked straight to Thomas, who was reading to 3 kids under the tree. The woman paused, her voice breaking slightly as she said, "I was here once, 25 years ago. You gave me a wooden toy horse and told me I was brave. I still have it." Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he smiled and placed his hand gently over hers. She left the flowers on his bench. That afternoon, the children planted them around the base of the oak tree. Thomas kept coming every day, even as the seasons turned and his steps grew slower. But now he wasn't alone. The town had finally seen him, not just as a veteran, or an old man, or a stranger, but as someone who had given everything for others without ever asking for anything in return. And when the time came, when he no longer appeared at the gates one morning, and the bench sat empty, the children placed his album there, open to the photo of him smiling in uniform, surrounded by them. They told new stories about him, stories that would grow with them, stories they would pass down to their own children one day, not as tales of war or sorrow, but as proof that one quiet man, carrying the weight of the past, could change the future simply by showing up and staying.